Deus, o salutaris nostre, Dominex Deus, Dominex Deus, Dominex Deus, Deus noster, Dominex Deus, Angeli, Arcangeli, Ave Patri, Laudatorem Domino Majestatis.
How's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, May 28th, and today has been quite the rough day. We're going to be going over some concerning document leaks coming out of my diocese, and these are confirmed. They've been somewhat verified by reputable sources. The Pillar verified the leak. And I wanted to go over, beside that, I don't have much comment on the other announcement, which was last week about the new Latin Mass chapel opening up near me, which happens to involve also the closure of all of the other Latin Mass parishes in the entirety of my diocese. But yeah, we're going to be going over all of that stuff. We're going to be also going over some of the very interesting news around this, because a lot of people saw the document, but there's actually a little bit more than the document itself, which released. There's a bit about some of the personnel within the diocese and things like that. So I'm going to go over all of that. I really want to highlight a few of the teachings of Pope Francis and Pope Leo as well on the liturgy. And I just want to look at a smattering of a few documents, a little bit look at a little bit of canonical principles and things like that. I mean, this is going to be a bit of a smattering of a stream where I go into a bunch of different sources. I recommend resources for further reading. So with a lot of these things, because this has to do with liturgical law, and liturgical law, some of it obviously is in relation to the natural and divine law, but a lot of it is in relation to canon law. And I don't claim any sort of special or unique competence when it comes to canon law. So anything I say in relation to that, which is not going to be that much, but anything I say in relation to that, remember that this is obviously to be taken with a grain of salt. Obviously to be taken with a grain of salt, because canon law is a very difficult discipline and it's very easy to miss things. But I'm not saying anything on my own, understanding of things. It's things that I've heard from reputable sources, things that I've read in primary source documents like the code itself, and then also an excellent resource called the Exegetical Code of Canon Law. Exegetical commentary on the Code of Canon Law. So a lot of things like that, you can, if you want to read more about this or verify things or anything like that, you can look into those things. But yeah, that's going to be a smattering of a lot of resources. And I wanted to begin, though, with obviously pray for my bishop, pray for my diocese, pray for the priests of my diocese, pray for the church as a whole, for His Holiness Pope Leo. But alongside of that, I want to remind you guys, in this process of very difficult and trying times, when bishops are overstepping their bounds, which there are cases of this, bishops are acting in ways in which they're not supposed to, you have to remember not to lose your soul in the process. Because other people, when they do things which are sinful, which are wrong, which are perhaps, if we want to chalk this up to ignorance and imprudence, it's somehow going to be a negligent act, they can cause scandal in other people. And when we use the term scandal, we actually mean something very particular in the Catholic tradition. By scandal, we mean causing another person to sin, right? Scandal is you do something and then somebody else sees that you did that thing, and then you yourself, or that other person rather, sins because of your bad action. So you have to guard yourselves from scandal. Scandal must come, but woe to them from whom they come, right? So you have to remember, as you are thinking through and processing this type of news, especially my fellow Catholics in the Diocese of Charlotte, you have to remember that it's very easy for us to lose our souls in the process. We can lose our souls in many different ways. We can lose our souls by acts of imprudence. We can lose our souls by calumny. We can lose our souls by inordinate despair. We can lose our souls by many different immoral acts. We can lose our souls very easily in this time through scandalizing other people within our parishes and within our communities. So you have to remember to not act effeminately and follow after your passions, but rather follow after reason and follow after the dictates of an objective moral order, right? So when it comes to these types of situations, there are, and we can very easily discern that there are a lot of responses which are incredibly unhelpful. And these incredibly unhelpful responses are actually going to damage the situation of many of these communities, right? And not only that, but damage your own soul. But there are things that can be done. There are things that can be done. And by saying there are things that can be done, crashing out and kind of having emotional vomit in the public sphere is not one of those things that can be done in a helpful way. One of the things that can be done is that when it comes to the Code of Canon Law, when it comes to the canonical procedures of the Church, we've actually been given certain rights. As laymen and anybody under authority, they've been given certain rights in canon law. And one of these rights is a right of appeal, right of recourse. So this right of recourse comes down to either entire parishes, which have to be from their pastor, or groups of individuals or individuals themselves appealing certain legislative decrees that they fall under. So you can initiate an appeal. If you go on tanbooks.com, they actually have, because Tanbooks is based in Charlotte, they actually have a guide for the process of appeal, how you send a letter of appeal, what's to be contained in the letter of appeal, how you follow up on this letter, et cetera, et cetera. So I would encourage people, if you want to follow after reason, if you want to follow after something which may actually have some sort of recourse in the forum of law, then what you ought to do is you ought to have you ought to initiate recourse. I guess, to put it in that language, to initiate recourse to appeal these decisions, because ultimately these decisions can be taken to Rome. It can be in the hands of the proper dicastery. So those are things. So on the one hand, you can do that. That's something which is something, rather than is completely nothing and only damaging to your soul and other people. But beside that, you can act in certain ways which are going to build up those who are affected by these type of legislative decrees, right? And in your own ways and in your own circumstances, you ought to discern how you can do that. But I just want to, before we even go into this, to pray for my bishop and our diocese, to and to pray for everybody who is negatively involved, and to pray also for the people who are tempted to various different immoral acts in response to these types of abuses of power. Because I really don't like doing a stream like this, right? I really don't like doing a stream where I'm going to have to very publicly disagree with a bishop. That's just not a fun stream to do. So I just want to keep all of those things in mind before we even continue, right? So the first place I wanted to start, and this is a relatively famous address of Leo the 14th. This is an address which a lot of people quote, but this is the address of Leo the 14th to the participants in the Jubilee of Oriental Churches. This is from May 14th. And he makes an interesting comment about the liturgy and about tradition in the liturgy that is extremely, extremely helpful for understanding and contextualizing how we ought to think of these things, right? So this is what he says to Eastern Catholics. He says, "The church needs you. The contributions that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies. Liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of the primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the values so typical of Eastern spirituality: constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. It is vital, then, that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them." Notice that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake perhaps of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism or utilitarianism. So in the mind of Leo XIV, when he's thinking of the liturgy, he is understanding that there are certain primary values, right? And these primary values are actually presenting God in his majesty and in his glory, to turn against our own sins, to focus on penitential acts, these sort of things. And by attenuating some of the traditions, by bringing back some of these traditions that are able to evoke these things for the sake of practicality, for the sake of popularity, for the sake of any of these things, this is going to corrupt it with a mentality of consumerism. So that's the thought of Leo XIV when he's thinking through these things. And we can also find something very particular that he says in his address to the cardinals as well. So in his address to the cardinals, he actually discusses some of the emphases that he wants of his pontificate. And with one of these emphases, it's very interesting that he mentions this. He says, "In this regard, I would like to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, from which I would like to highlight several fundamental points." And one of these fundamental points that he brings up when he's quoting Evangelii Gaudium is growth in collegiality and synodality. So that's attention to the sensus fidei, especially in its most authentic and inclusive form, such as popular piety. So one of these emphases that he wants to bring forth in his pontificate is popular piety, is being able to not squash popular piety as they arise within different communities. Obviously, and I'm going to bring up now Evangelii Gaudium. We can read through what he means by popular piety. There's certain bad instances of popular piety, false popular piety, that gets mentioned by Pope Francis. We can think of a million different. I think one of them he mentions is like alcoholism, which is kind of funny that he mentions alcoholism as a false form of popular piety. I guess he's been around a lot of Italians. Actually, specifically, he seems to be mentioning very Latin American coded things. But anyways, when it comes to popular piety, that is the way in which very concretely the gospel has its effect within various different communities. Right? That is the way authentic popular piety, which is led by a guiding by the tradition of the church, that very concretely and locally places the spirit of the gospel within a certain community, right? And we have unfortunately, a lot of people read these sort of things, and they have such a twisted mentality where they think, oh, and I mean to put it very bluntly, they think that, oh, popular piety only applies to brown people, right? If you're African, you can have the Zaire rite. If you're South American, you can have your forms of popular piety. If you're Italian, you can have your forms of popular piety. But like white people, yeah, that was a joke that Italians aren't white. But white people do not get popular piety, right? You cannot have if there are certain communities in the United States and in Europe who actually form, young people forming around these types of communities and finding spiritual nourishment within these different practices, that's actually not a valid form of popular piety. But this is completely incorrect. We have to apply the principles of the teaching of the church universally. We can't apply it only, this only counts for brown people, for white people, popular piety isn't something which actually exists. That's completely wrong. So we can see how some of the principles that are going to be employed for the sake of unity, that's the claim. But some of the principles that are employed by Bishop Martin are actually against the teaching magisterium of Pope Francis, which has been, teaching. I say of Pope Francis, but this goes much further back. The teaching magisterium of Pope Francis, as emphasized recently explicitly by Pope Leo XIV. So yeah, if you want to read this from Evangelii Gaudium, it's from 122 to 126. I'll just let you read it for yourself because I kind of explained this. But so there was the banning of the Latin Mass that occurred last week. I wanted to bring up first in this whole big saga. I won't get into uh, Traditionis Custodes and the legislative uh, aspects of that, but we can kind of immediately jump into the response because various different priests of the Diocese of Charlotte did actually write a very thorough and very mild mannered and very pious response. Right, this was full of filial piety and respect for the honor which is due to the episcopate. It's a very good letter. But just to emphasize before we read this letter, and this is something that I'm going to emphasize as I read through the letter that was proposed by Bishop Martin, is that when it comes to the type of text that they quote about the celebration, the use, not necessarily, because we have to distinguish two things, and this is something that a lot of people confuse. We have to distinguish the use of Latin in the liturgy from the celebration of the TLM. Right, the use of Latin in the liturgy is different from the than the celebration of the TLM. So when it comes to the use of Latin in the liturgy, there is a much more extensive body of magisterial teachings in and since the Second Vatican Council than there is from these rather than the specific legislative norms around the TLM. Right. So the use of Latin in the liturgy actually has many more documents than get mentioned here. You can read Usicum Sacram from the Second Vatican Council or Sacrosanctum Concilium. These talk about and praise the use of Latin in the liturgy. They order the use of Latin in the liturgy. You can look at the various different documents from St. Paul VI, but especially the audiences that he gave before the institution of the Novus Ordo. There's plenty of documents from St. John Paul II. What I mean to highlight here is that when it comes to the official teaching of the church, and even in our bishops' conference, the USCCB, when it comes to the official teaching of the church, there is a fairly consistent encouragement of the use of Latin in the liturgy. This is something which, when you look at the Code of Canon Law, when it specifically is talking about the Mass being celebrated, it says you can celebrate you can celebrate the Mass in the official form, which is given in Latin or in the vernacular translation adapted to your location. When you look in the official vernacular form given in the United States, you see that there are various different Latin prayers which are in the Missal. If you ever look through a Missal, you see that with some of the common prayers, they are actually given a bilingual form. You can even look at this with someone like your hymnal books, but with the missal, which is given to us from the USCCB, you have certain prayers which are given both in Latin and in English. So it's completely evident from the teaching of the Church since the Second Vatican Council, from the praxis of the Roman Pontiff, from the documents which are given to us from the USCCB, from our missal, from the Code of Canon Law, from the ways in which the canonists interpret the Code of Canon Law, we see that there is a great deal of encouragement of the Latin language in the liturgy, even if it doesn't happen to take the form of the traditional Latin Mass. But anyways, I kind of digress because this is specifically about the TLM. So, dear Bishop Martin, we offer our sincere prayers that this letter finds you in good health and spirits. We, the priests entrusted with the pastoral care of those attending the traditional Latin Mass in 4 of our parishes within the Diocese of Charlotte, respectfully write to request a reconsideration of the planned steps considering the implementation of Traditionis Custodes. The presence of the traditional Latin Mass in our diocesan parishes dates back to the period following Pope Benedict XVI's Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum in 2007. The late pontiff reaffirmed the legitimacy of the faithful's desire for access to the traditional liturgy, echoing what Pope St. John Paul II in 1988 termed legitimate desires for the Latin Mass. This motu proprio was undoubtedly part of his broader initiative to promote the hermeneutic of continuity within the life of the Church. Pope Benedict XVI believed that both liturgical forms could coexist peacefully within the Church and even within the same parish. Such has indeed been the case in our parishes since its implementation. Our parishes have experienced harmony with all parishioners, regardless the liturgy being spiritually nourished. It is important to acknowledge that those attached to the traditional liturgy has, over the past 5 decades, often felt marginalized and discriminated against. Consequently, their trust in church leadership has understandably been weakened over time. A significant aspect of our ministry involves reconciliation and accompaniment for those who have felt unwelcome. We fear a reversal in policy will negatively impact the goodwill built up over the years. A primary concern, according to Traditionis Custodes, is the assertion that the presence of the traditional liturgy in parochial settings leads to division within the Church. We can affirm with confidence that this has not been the experience in our parishes. The planned removal of the Latin Mass from 4 parishes, affecting over 1,000 parishioners, is a matter of considerable consequence. To remove Catholics with legitimate desires from their own parishes is, we believe, a deeply painful action. We understand you are endeavoring to implement the Holy Father's will, as expressed in Traditionis Custodes. However, we respectfully submit the current plan appears to exceed the specified requirements of TC in at least 3 areas. 1, the decision not to request an extension of permissions from the Holy See. 2, the decision to allow for only 1 designated site. And 3, the decision not to establish a Latin Mass community for the faithful. We believe that it is crucial to consider not only the letter of TC, but also how the Holy See has chosen to implement the documents in the broader Church. Other dioceses have been granted extensions, others offer multiple Mass sites, and others have established Latin Mass communities. Even Cardinal Roque, considered the primary architect of TC, in an interview on March 7th, 2025, reaffirmed that young people who desire attending the Latin Mass remain faithful members of the Church. Quote, of course, it is good that people want to be part of the Church, and there is no reason why they cannot. There's nothing wrong with attending the Mass celebrated with the 1962 Missal. That has been accepted since the time of Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis, end quote. Given that the faithful possess legitimate desires for the traditional Mass and sacraments, and given pastoral leniency demonstrated by the Holy See in its implementation, we respectfully question any perceived need to interpret the document in the strictest possible manner or exceed its written requirements. Therefore, we respectfully request that you reconsider the plans for the traditional Latin Mass in the Diocese of Charlotte. We ask that the implementation not surpass the strict requirements of TC. We further request that you become more acquainted with our Latin Mass communities to better understand their desires, challenges, and pastoral needs. We are confident that you will recognize in those parishioners faithful sons and daughters of the Church who simply wish to live in peace with access to the traditional liturgy in their own parishes. Having listened to the pastors and their parishioners, we trust you will be confident in the legitimacy of requesting an extension from the Holy See. Should the Holy See deny such a request, we would hope to provide for the needs of these faithful to the best of our ability. With utmost respect, we humbly ask for your reconsideration. So this document right here, this is from the priests of the Latin Mass communities. It's really, honestly, it's kind of just sad to read this, and it is really sad because like you can read like a sort of authentic. It's like there's a very great degree of authenticity that you get when you're reading something like this. But yeah, that's just it's an awesome, absolutely awesome um, letter that I think a lot of us could look at and could consider modeling our own responses to the situation on this. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually get into the mass manifesto itself. So this is from Rati Cheli, but at first this was something which was claimed to be, we don't know whether it's real. This was from an anonymous source, blah 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 blah, all of that stuff. But it was confirmed by the pillar independently to be a real document. It was something which was set forward. Um, it was set forward under the pontificate. Well, it was written under the pontificate of Pope Francis. It was something which was discussed and it was never implemented, and it was placed on ice because those in the presbyteral council and other individuals were very much in opposition to this document. But the reason the document's important is because it does give off some of the ideology. And I'll use that word ideology. Gives off some of the ideology around the liturgy and around the type of pastoral control that the bishop claims over the liturgy. Because we have in the beginning, he makes this claim, and let me see. Yeah, so basically starts writing about in general what the liturgy is, blah 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 blah, liturgy, liturgy, liturgy. But then he goes on and he starts to talk about the bishop's role as in control of the liturgy. And this is very important here because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this. This is a misconception actually that the greatest Pope's planner. I'm I'm just clowning with that. The greatest Pope's planner on planet Earth, Michael Lofton. He actually said something very, very bad about this, which I'm going to cover later in the document. But he says, as the bishop of the Diocese of Charlotte, it falls to me to set my own preferences aside to be in communion with our Holy Father Pope Francis, my brother bishops. By the way, this is there is going there is going to be a stinging degree of irony when it comes to the claim that he's setting aside his personal preferences, because oh my goodness, when you read the rest of this document and he's telling priests that they can't, he's like telling priests that they, restricting their private prayers that they pray before and after mass, restricting certain stylistic choices like the fiddleback being worn as a liturgical garment, forcing altar girls. What else? Not allowing veiled women to engage in any of the ministries of the church. There was a bunch of other like the St. Michael's prayer. There's a bunch of other comments that he makes, and it's like phrasing this as you doing this because you want to keep in line with your brother bishops and with the Holy Father Pope Francis. That it just strikes you as disingenuous when you actually look what Pope Francis in his teaching, in his doctrinal pronouncements. You can argue about what his personal beliefs are about different liturgical forms. He says some funny things about that occasionally, but in his doctrinal pronouncements, whether you're actually keeping in accordance with the principles of His Holiness. But anyways, then to the brother bishops as well. Together, and by the way, the whole point of that is, yeah, he actually is just setting forth his personal preferences. Together, we must discern the signs of the times, as well as the particular and unique dynamics throughout the Diocese of Charlotte in the Southeast. I wish the signs of the times were being discerned. In this process, there are no particularities that would allow any of us to contravene the magisterium of the Church or the rich tradition that has been handed down to us. Notice right here, just like the way this is phrased, you're contravening the magisterium of the church. And then you read the specific directives. It's like, oh, you're contravening the magisterium of the church. That must mean that you're, trying to like hold, like gay marriages within your parish, or you're trying to, consecrate, leavened bread in the mass rather than unleavened bread if you're a Latin priest, that you're contravening the magisterium of the church. It's just such a I don't like this way of phrasing it. No theologian, pastor, blog slash podcaster, religious congregation, or well intentioned pious layperson, come on, just say layman, can claim this role for himself or herself. I wonder, by the way, the mention of podcaster, I wonder who he's referencing to. He's honestly, like, yeah, sure, probably Taylor Marshall in the back of the mind, but is it like Sensus Fidelium? Because Sensus Fidelium is in Charlotte. It would make a lot of sense. Who is the blogger and podcaster who is trying to, for the Diocese of Charlotte, change the way in which the Mass is celebrated? I have no idea who this is in reference to. Ultimately, as the moderator of the liturgy in this diocese and chief liturgist, I must exhort each one of us to live this life of prayer and worship to which we are called. May this letter be the one that I pray you will receive in the spirit of our shared vocation to serve the common good. And then he talks about, particularly, this is really from the beginning, about his role as bishop. He makes his claim from the beginning and says, I am bishop. I'm in charge of all of the liturgies in this diocese. So this is the way in which this is going to go, right? This is the claim he makes from the beginning. Now, a lot of the faithful, when they read this, they may have this idea that the bishop, when it comes to teaching and when it comes to matters of praxis, the bishop basically rules in a way in his diocese in a autonomous way. Autonomous may be the best way of putting it. But this is actually just not the case. When it comes to those things that take place in relation to the liturgy, and specifically this is spoken about in Canon 838. So if you want to read Canon 838 and then the exegetical commentary on the Code of Canon Law about Canon 838, there are certain things which are obviously parts of divine and natural law when it comes to any sort of liturgical form, right? There are things which are parts of a sort of immutable aspect of ecclesiastical law. There are certain things which are reserved to the Apostolic See. So the Apostolic See has the right to do this. So, for example, the Apostolic See has the right to, issue a motu proprio which restricts the TLM or doesn't restrict the TLM. That's a right that the Apostolic See, at least if you disagree with, this, it's at least one that they've claimed for themselves, right? So the Apostolic See has certain rights, and then the bishops' conferences have a certain degree of competence. They can do certain things with some on their own, some with permission, need for explicit permission for the Apostolic See, and then finally, kind of at the last level, there's certain limited ways in which the bishop has competence when it comes to the liturgy. So the bishop is able to, in certain ways, rule over his flock. But really, the bishop's role ends up being more so the preservation and implementation of the laws that come from those higher, degrees, comes from the bishop's conference, comes from the Holy See. So no, just because the bishop is the chief liturgical authority in his diocese, that doesn't mean that he can, micromanage every single aspect of this and say that, the priest can or cannot say certain prayers before and after, like private prayers while vesting, that the priest, cannot, I don't know, that the priest must, bring forward altar girls by any by the priest must have altar girls, mandatory altar girls in the liturgy. There are certain things in which the bishop does not actually have competence towards. So when it comes to a few of the issues in here, he is exceeding his competence. So by exceeding his competence, it means certain things in which he actually doesn't have authority to cover, that haven't been delegated to him by the law of the church. So there's certain things in that aspect, and there's other things which not only did he go at issues which were beside his competence. He actually went against certain rules which were established, or certain laws which are established from those with a higher competence. Right? Does that make sense? So he might go against something from the Apostolic See about the liturgy. He might go against something against the Bishops' Conference about the liturgy. So the example that I gave before, actually, the use of Latin. The use of Latin is something which every priest has the right to do, because this is delegated by law in the promulgation of the missal, right? So you look at the Code of Canon Law. I can read the. This is just not me saying this, by the way. This is other individuals as well who are canonists. You can read the exegetical commentary again, but Canon 928 says the Eucharistic celebration is to be carried out in the Latin language or in another language, provided the liturgical texts have been legitimately approved. So basically, there's two forms which it allows. It allows for this form, which has been approved, explicitly approved by the Holy See. So the Holy See publishes a missal and says you can celebrate in this form. But then when it comes to the bishops' conferences, they have the obligation to publish a vernacular translation of it, right? So you can look at that. You can look at the missal itself. You look at the vernacular missal. What do you see? You see a lot of Latin prayers. So the vernacular missal, this is something which is approved by the Holy See, promulgated by the Bishops' Conference. So what you can't have is you can't have a bishop, and I guess this will explain it the best way. You can't have a bishop telling a priest that he can't pray something that is in the missal, right? So, for example, you can't have a bishop tell a priest, "Oh, I'm the chief liturgical officer in this diocese, so you can't pray the first canon. You can't pray the Roman canon during the Mass, even though it's in the Novus Ordo Missae." You cannot have a bishop do that. That is exceeding his authority, right? This canon of the Mass has been something which is legitimately promulgated in the liturgical books. So you can't have a bishop just tell them, no, you can't do that. So the same reasoning applies to, in the missals, you have in some cases you have bilingual prayers which are given. You have the Pater Noster here, you have the Our Father here, you have the Ave Maria here, you have the Hail Mary here, right? You have bilingual prayers which are given within the missal. So a bishop can't tell a priest, "Hey, you can't use this option because it's in Latin and I don't like Latin." The bishop, that's not, he doesn't have competence in that area. He's been given competence in other areas of the liturgy, right? But he hasn't been given competence where the Holy See or where the Bishops' Conference has legislated otherwise, if that makes sense. So in many cases, not only is he overextending his authority, but he's actually contradicting other authorities, other higher authorities than him. So he can't just tell all the priests, don't include any of the commons in Latin. He just can't do that, right? So now he goes on, ironically, and this is fine enough. Oh yeah, by the way, that is the part right there. That is the part right there. Before I forget to talk about the Michael Lofton thing, that is the part right there that Michael Lofton defended his ability to do this. Yeah, he just Michael Lofton defended the ability of this bishop to. He doesn't agree with it, but he defended his ability and his right to do this. I'm going to flip real quick just so you show that I'm not making anything up, because he's reading this exact document that we're reading.
Understand the language. So only if the majority of them understand it. Otherwise, it needs to be all vernacular. And, some people are going to point out, this is just so far removed from what Vatican II was calling for, where it spoke of Latin needing to be retained in the Reformed liturgy. But Vatican II, in the same place, also says it's up to Episcopal conferences to determine how much of the vernacular they will introduce. And, pretty much all of the Episcopal conferences after Vatican II chose to go with all vernacular. That's why you have pretty much all vernacular.
That's wrong. That's just completely incorrect. Completely incorrect. Absolutely wrong. On every account, that is wrong. You can look at what the bishops' conferences say on the use of Latin. The bishop conferences, I'm pulling up one of the instructions just to see how completely wrong this is. We can look at Sing to the Lord, Music and Divine Worship. This is something 2007 issued by the USCCB, and it has a section. Let me see if I can find the section. But I guess I'll just control. Yeah, Latin in the liturgy. That's the section right there. It has a section, Latin in the liturgy. Has a section, USCCB Bishops Conference, Latin in the liturgy. And there are sections of the missal with bilingual prayers. And this is something which is given by the Holy See. But it says, the use of the vernacular is the norm in most liturgical celebrations in the Diocese of the United States, for the sake of a better comprehension of the mystery being celebrated. However, care should be taken to foster the role of Latin in the liturgy, particularly in liturgical song. Pastors should, so this is something they're telling pastors to do, pastors should ensure that the faithful may also be able to say or to sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them. They should be able to sing those parts of the Mass proper to them, at least according to the simpler melodies. So not only saying, but singing those ordinary parts of the Mass that pertain to them. At international, so this is just normal liturgies, but beyond this, at international and multicultural gatherings of different liturgical groups, it is most appropriate to celebrate the liturgy in Latin, with the exception of the readings, the homily, and the prayers of the faithful. This is why Pope Leo XIV celebrates the liturgy in Latin all the time, by the way. In addition, selections of Gregorian chant should be sung at each gathering whenever possible. To facilitate the singing of texts in Latin, the singer should be trained in its correct pronunciation and understand its meaning. To the greatest extent possible and applicable, singers and choir directors are encouraged to deepen their familiarity with the Latin language. Whenever the Latin language poses an obstacle to singers, even after sufficient training has been provided, for example, in pronunciation, understanding of the text, or confident rendition of a piece, it would be more prudent to employ vernacular language in the liturgy. So, right here, no, it gets further. I forgot this part. It gets even better. Further, seminarians should receive the preparation needed to understand and celebrate Mass in Latin, and also to use Latin text and execute Gregorian chant. All the USCCB says all seminarians need to be able to celebrate the Mass in Latin. This sounds like Michael Lofton saying nothing in the vernacular. In promoting the use of Latin in the liturgy, pastors should always employ that form of participation which best matches the capabilities of each congregation. Okay, so Lofton was just completely wrong. But I mean, are we surprised by this? Anyways, so first, there's the talk about the liturgical rubrics and texts. And yeah, awesome. Liturgical rubrics and texts, like that's your job as a bishop, right? There's a funny story from my bishop, because technically speaking, while I reside in the Diocese of Charlotte, I'm a member of the Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter. So I'm a member of the Personal Ordinariate. He's Bishop Stephen Lopes is my bishop. In case you guys are wondering, in case you guys need to tell on me, Bishop Lopes is my bishop. But I heard a funny story from one of the priests. He had an accident where he broke his leg, so he was at home for long periods of time. And what he decided to do is he decided to go through and watch all of the masses of different priests throughout the Ordinariate. And he was known for sending out emails to the priests and saying, hey, this is what the instructions for the Mass say. This is what you did. Stop doing that. Follow the instructions. Bishop Lopes. He would send these emails out to multiple different priests, because that's the job of the bishop, right? The bishop has obviously some sort of say, as I mentioned, which are given to him by the relevant laws. But usually the bishop's role is in implementing what those higher authorities are going to give for the standards of the recitation of the Mass. So yeah, this part, sure, awesome. This is great. This is great. This is cool. This is awesome. But then he goes into the Latin language, and this is where it gets really bad, because he just explicitly contradicts the Second Vatican Council, St. Paul VI, St. John Paul II, etc. He's explicitly the USCCB itself. He's he's explicitly contradicting many different documents and teachings of the church. Everything from the doctrinal pronouncements connected with certain legislative documents like apostolic constitutions and motu proprios, to certain allocutions, certain audiences of the popes, documents from ecumenical councils, every instructions from bishops' conferences, everything up and down the register, he's contradicting with what he said in this section right here. One of the desires expressed by the Second Vatican Council was to embrace the vernacular language in our liturgies as an intelligible vessel through which the faithful may better comprehend the mysteries of the faith. Okay, sure, that's what happened. In my experience here in the Diocese of Charlotte, which is kind of funny, because he when he wrote this, he had only been bishop for, I believe, a few months at that point. So very odd that he's talking about his experience in the Diocese of Charlotte when 98% of the Diocese of Charlotte has more experience in the Diocese of Charlotte. But anyways, I digress. I've encountered a frequent and prevalent use of the Latin language in our parish liturgies. Yes, you have. You have done this because it's one of those points of popular piety. A point of popular piety that actually the Diocese of Charlotte takes pride in. I used to, and this is funny, when I would talk to a lot of people, when I would talk about the Diocese of Charlotte, I would praise the Diocese of Charlotte. Because as I experienced, going to more and more parishes in the Diocese of Charlotte, I found a lot of Diocese of Charlotte, to put it kind of in ways, comprehensible way, pithy way, is a diocese full of unicorn Novus Ordos, right? There's a bunch of very good Novus Ordos in the Diocese of Charlotte. Like even you go to like Western North Carolina to one of like a random parish out there. Like I found some of the most beautifully celebrated Novus Ordos. It has a lot of Latin. Like even the a parish close to me that's very it's called Saint Therese, if anybody's from the diocese. So if you know the diocese, Saint Therese is like plain, I guess to put it like that. It's plain. It's not great. With some of the liturgical aspects, it's a little bit off. But even there, they literally started chanting certain parts of the Mass in Latin. So even a parish like that has Latin in the Mass. It's very common in the Diocese of Charlotte. It's very common, and this is why under Bishop Jugi's, I almost said Jugi, like the anti-Eastern Orthodox priest, but under his rule of the Diocese of Charlotte, vocations were exploding, parishes were filled to the brim. I mean, it was he was very successful, and one of the things that he encouraged was traditional forms of the liturgy. He says Latin is used from place to place for various and different motivations. Could be because they love God. That is one of the various different motivations of using Latin. Some have employed its use as a safeguard against what I've addressed above, textual innovation and abuse. That's a really weird way. People are using Latin to safeguard against textual innovation and abuse. No, that's not why. That's not at all why they're doing it. However, the faithful's full conscious and active participation is hindered wherever Latin is employed. You kidding me? The Sanctus being chanted in Latin hinders the faithful's full conscious and active participation in the liturgy, even though all of the faithful know what the Sanctus is. Are you kidding? Most of our faithful do not understand and will never comprehend the Latin language, especially those on the periphery. That's odd, because he's going to mention immigrants in a second. It seems like when I go to a Mass and they have Latin parts, it seems like the most happy people there are like the 70-year-old Hispanic women who are there with their chapel veils on. It seems like the people on the periphery seem to be the most happy about those things happening in like a normie Novus Ordo type parish. It is fallacious to think that if we employ Latin more frequently, the faithful will get used to it and finally understand it. I don't know, like my wife prays prayers in Latin and she doesn't understand anything about Latin. Why? Because it's frequent. Our ancestors, quote, heard quote, heard the Mass in Latin every Sunday, but never understood it. Their experience was the reason that the council asked the entire church to welcome the use of the vernacular languages. I find it disturbing that so many pastors and celebrants are inclined to force an unknown language on their congregation when the Lord's mission is to engage the lost. It's a scandal. Of course, anybody who's been to one of the parishes in the Diocese of Charlotte that has sections of the Mass in Latin knows that this is just a ridiculous way of putting it. People like it. People love it. I mean, you can get and this is actually something which is completely opposite to what his line of argumentation. If you get actually, I will give an example. I'll actually give an example that I have from the Diocese of Charlotte. I had a family member who was visiting from out of town, and they were open-minded about, they're Protestant, but they're open-minded. So they wanted to go to a Mass. So we went to Mass, and we actually went to St. Anne's in Charlotte. It's a very well done Mass. And that, for an individual who is not Catholic, it was very striking. Like that was something which struck them. That was something which actually did engage with somebody who was outside of the bounds of the church. And you can hear witness to witness to witness, time and time and time again, of people saying the same thing. People look at the response from a lot of even secular people about the Latin being used around the papal conclave. They saw Latin being used, and that was something which actually did engage with them on a level that a sort of banal and cringe boomerish, hymn is not going to be able to engage with them on, right? On Eagle's Wings is not going to engage with them like the Litany of the Saints chanted in Latin. I'm sorry. There's a different degree of engagement. So there actually is a way in which you can call it generational, you can call it cultural, you can call it whatever you want. There is a way in which there's a unique instance of the Latin language engaging with the lost. Like, this is something which does happen. So like it is so completely deaf and just odd to relegate the use of Latin to something which doesn't engage the lost. The church's teaching on evangelization and missionary efforts cry to us for sensitivity on the part of pastoral leaders to engage people where they are, to bring them to Christ. Full, conscious, and active participation in a liturgy that uses Latin would require each person to learn the Latin language, which is an impossible request. No, it doesn't. It actually doesn't. There's a thing which we started printing called bilingual missals. Bilingual missals. You can have full, conscious, and active participation in the liturgy. Now, in many areas before the council, there were, and in many different communities, there were people who were not actually having a full, conscious, and active participation, right? This was something which happened. But the church had encouraged the printing of certain bilingual missals so people would be able to follow along with the liturgy. Certain prayer books, which included the ordinary parts of the Mass. There were a million different ways in which people were able to engage in this way without having to learn the Latin language. So, and I mean, or you could just do literally the general way in which this is done. General way in which this is done is, if you're gonna have something in Latin, they just print it out side by side in the bulletin, or just open up just get a missal with the parts which often get said in Latin, bilingual. There's a million different ways of doing this, but and then in the parishes, my point here is that in the parishes that do this, they actually do this. The parishes that do have parts in Latin, they actually do this. They find ways in which to engage both the benefits of the Latin language and also keep the full, conscious, and active participation that was emphasized by the Second Vatican Council, right? So many of our faithful simply walk away. This was ridiculous. So many of our faithful simply walk away when they don't understand the language and then miss out on the other beautiful aspects of the liturgical celebration. When does this ever happen? I've been to a lot of liturgies in the Diocese of Charlotte where Latin was used, and I have never once seen a single individual leave because Latin. There was the Sanctus started to get chanted in Latin. Of all of a sudden, you had droves of people, running for the door because they just couldn't handle. They couldn't handle having to follow along a bilingual text within their bulletin. The Latin language, no doubt, holds a special and official role within the Latin Church. In fact, all official text documents and ritual books are published in Latin as the Editio Typica, from which the vernacular translations are derived. The Church even exhorts that the Latin language be studied in seminaries and theological studies. The Church does not, however, call for the Latin language to be used widely in the liturgy. This is a lie. This is a lie. A complete lie. Look at Musicum Sacram. Look at Sacrosanctum Concilium. Look at the various different audiences of St. Paul VI in preparation for the release of the Novus Ordo. You can look at many different documents. You can look at the commentary on Canon 928 and look at the documents in which they cite from St. John Paul II. You can look at all of those instances of the Church, or look at the USCCB. All of the instances of the Church recommending very strongly that as part of our spiritual patrimony, that people understand and be able to sing the simple parts of the liturgy in Latin. You saw me read the text from the USCCB, where it said pastors should ensure that the faithful, when it comes to the ordinary prayers, be able to recite them and sing them in a simple tone. So this is a lie. This is against the teaching of the Church. On the contrary, we are called to use languages that our people understand. Which, it's not mutually exclusive that it be in Latin in a language that the people understand, but I digress. I cannot comprehend why. Yeah, why didn't you just ask? Why didn't you just ask? If you asked, I would, I or anybody else in the diocese who attends these sort of prayers, you can ask, the old Hispanic grandma in the parish where there happens to be Latin prayers sometimes. Ask her, do you like it when they have these Latin chants? Why do you like it? And she'll give you a very clear answer, actually. I cannot comprehend why a vocal minority, like this language of outrage is just, it's just awful. I cannot comprehend why a vocal minority of the faithful who themselves admit to not understanding Latin, not me, not me. Anyways, beside that point, they do understand the texts, because for a lot of them, there is actually an assiduous and very devout practice within a lot of these parishes to get the people to be able to understand what's going on in these texts, by the way. So it's just a caricature to say that these parishes and the pastors of these parishes are negligent. Because that's what you're accusing them of. You're accusing them of being negligent by not doing what the Church does. Church recommends, rather. I cannot comprehend why a vocal minority of the faithful who themselves admit to not understanding Latin would advocate a revival of the Latin language within our diocese, rendering the liturgy unintelligible for all but a few of our people. Moreover, as a diocese that is comprised of so many immigrants, we would be imposing on them an even greater burden. I won't comment, but there are a lot of immigrants who go to the DLM. That's all I'll say. Not only are they trying to learn English and assimilate into our culture, but then they have another language imposed upon them that is foreign. Which is funny, anyways. And then this is the part which just makes me so mad, because at first I thought, okay, well maybe he went to seminary during a certain age in which they just didn't get taught about the documents from the Church during the post-conciliar era that talk about the wide use of Latin in the liturgy. Maybe he just didn't see this, right? He's a bishop, but okay. Maybe he just didn't. Maybe it's just a degree of negligence on this point. He says, some who desire the use of Latin can point to a few documents of the Church to justify their selections and personal preferences. It's not just a few documents of the Church. It's every document that talks about this issue. every single one of the documents that talk about this issue. So he knows about the documents that get quoted. While the church makes clear that we still embrace the ritual Latin patrimony, these choices to introduce Latin are not pastorally sensitive. I understand the majority of masses in our diocese are being celebrated in the vernacular. However, there are several places that are introducing Latin mass responses, Latin ordinary chants, Latin antiphons, and even even the memorial acclamation. They would never be able to figure out the like how many words are in the memorial acclamation in Latin, like 10 words. They would never be able to figure out those words. How could they do that? And the Our Father, which everybody should know in Latin anyways. And the Our Father. All these parts are rendered less engaging by the use of Latin. And then, by saying all these parts are rendered less engaging by the use of Latin, he quotes a USCCB document. What's the problem with this? We've already seen what the USCCB says. The USCCB tells them to do stuff like this, to have the responses and the chants and the antiphons and the Our Father and the acclamation. Those are the exact things that you would do if you're trying to implement the USCCB directives that I mentioned earlier. A place for using Latin in the liturgy would be, to name a few examples, a specific gathering of scholars, clergy, or those trained in classical music. This is not the reality in our parishes and communities, which this is just completely against what the church says. They don't say only for gatherings of scholars, clergy, and etc. Okay, so then he goes on to give examples of cross-pollination. He talks about kneeling and receiving on the tongue. He talks about altar rails and extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. There are many characteristics of blending aspects of the preconciliar Mass with the Novus Ordo Missae, which communicates the erroneous message that the Mass is not sufficient in itself to be a channel of the graces of Calvary in its fullest, which is just ridiculous that that's what this communicates. Several parishes have removed the use of lay extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion and introduced altar rails. St. Thomas Aquinas in Charlotte, awesome, by the way. Dude, oh my gosh, I love St. Thomas Aquinas in Charlotte. They have the altar rails. It's beautiful. These decisions frustrate the ability of the faithful to receive Holy Communion under both species, which is not even in place in our diocese. I've never been, since I've moved here, which was around 4 years ago, I've never been able to receive in both kinds in a single Mass in the Diocese of Charlotte. So definitely not since he's been here, which has been, like a year. These decisions frustrate the ability of the faithful to receive Holy Communion under both species, a fuller sign of the Eucharistic banquet. In addition to these two decisions is the tendency in some of these same parishes to exclude female altar servers. Based. I love going to a parish and seeing they'll either have no female altar servers or they'll have like the one female altar server that they kind of have to save face with the diocese. Awesome. It's awesome to see that. Using the altar rails to keep people out of the sanctuary. Is that why? Removing lay people's assistance with Holy Communion. You can assist by uniting your prayers with the sacrifice of the Mass. And welcoming only boys, W boys, this is Boys Club. Welcoming only boys to serve at the Eucharistic mysteries creates an air of clerical superiority. Communicate a spirit of unwelcoming, as if the congregation should just be spectators, and can suggest the parish rejects the liturgical reforms brought about on behalf of the Second Vatican Council. None of which the Second Vatican Council talks about, by the way. Two ritual elements of the Mass that are admittedly optional, but have become so widespread as to become almost normative, are the sign of peace and the procession of the gifts. Yeah, I'm going to skip over this section. Then he goes off about ornate vestments. overly ornate vestments that put more focus on the ministers than the Eucharist. Fiddleback, chasubles, berettas, cross stoles, server gloves, and the maniple. Which is just like, okay, literally Pope Leo wears these things. Pope Leo, there's pictures of Pope Leo celebrating the Mass with the fiddleback. So, and then also he critiques the vesting prayers. Before and after Mass, there should be an environment of welcoming and opening. In terms of gathering and exiting the church, music should be inviting and not distract from the faithful gathering and leaving in a spirit of community and engagement. And then he says, and this is just like, it's like, what the heck are we even doing? I mean, you got to laugh so you can't cry at this thing. After the dismissal, there are some churches that have reintroduced the communal recitation of the prayer of St. Michael the Archangel. St. Mark's in Huntersville, awesome parish, by the way. Awesome parish. It's so awesome at the end to recite the Leonine prayers. Just fires you up, you know. You're about to go to war. Total war. Your total war. While the intention to defeat the power of Satan and other evil spirits is commendable, I'm glad, its recitation at the end of Mass can lead to the unfortunate doubt that the Eucharistic liturgy is somehow insufficient to bring about the scattering of evil and the motivation to do good. Who thinks like this? Can you find me a single person who thinks, oh man, we didn't pray the St. Michael's prayer this week. I guess the Eucharist isn't going to be scattering evil and engaging and motivating us to do good. Are you kidding me? Like what is this? You're just looking for things. If parishes have the custom of praying this prayer communally at the end of Mass, it ought to be done separate from the liturgy and therefore no sooner than after the recessional hymn. And then he goes on about Ad Orientem. For some reason, this is a battle you want to fight is against Ad Orientem. The central element of our church buildings in the Eucharistic celebration is the altar of sacrifice. The altar is the new Calvary upon which the representation of the passion, death, and resurrection are carried out. It is a new Bethlehem where Christ is made flesh in the Eucharistic species. The Creator comes anew to his creation, and the Lord of Lords offers himself for adoration. W. In order for the faithful to participate as the counsel requires, visual engagement is necessary. What? Visual engagement is necessary? So you got to like see the movements of the hands that the counsel requires. For this reason, the church has been clear that Ad Orientem is not appropriate. Where has the church made clear that Ad Orientem is not appropriate? On the basis of visual engagement. That it's not appropriate? It has not been permitted and will not be permitted in the future in any public chapel, church, or oratory in the Diocese of Charlotte. Moreover, it is important that the altar of sacrifice be free of any visual impairment. Candles, standing crucifixes, and missal stands all impede the ability of the faithful to see the Eucharistic elements. Well, maybe what we have to do is we got to like start making everything like made out of glass, so you can see through everything, see it better. These elements were all incorporated into the Roman rite when it was offered ad orientem, but they no longer are needed on the altar in the Novus Ordo Missae. The two altar candles can easily be placed on the side of the altar rather than creating a visual obstacle on the front edge of the altar. Then he gives his liturgical norms. And some of these liturgical norms are kind of like, some of these get like really ridiculous. Like you thought this was bad, it gets really ridiculous. So he has the one on altar rails. Movable altar rails should be removed and permanently fixed altar rails should no longer be used. The altars be freestanding and Mass must be celebrated facing the people. I'm trying to find the most ridiculous. Oh yeah, there's the technology ones, which were just okay. Yeah, technology. That doesn't make people walk away. No person may change, add, or remove any part of the rubrics, prayers, or texts of the liturgy. Yeah, including the Latin parts in the Roman Missal. W. The vernacular. Oh yeah, this part in masses with the faithful, the vernacular is to be retained for all parts of the mass. Latin mass parts are to be chosen judiciously, only for those particular celebrations in which the majority of the participants understand the language. Sign of peace always. Presentation of the gifts. Then this one is like, I'm telling you, just like ridiculous ones. The ringing of a bell to signal the congregation to stand before the opening hymn is no longer to be used at any mass. Why? Why can't you ring the bell? What's wrong with ringing the bell? The bell is awesome. You know, you're sitting there, you're praying, and then ring ring, and then they have the processional. It's awesome. Do other, like, apparently everyone is just like anti bell ringing and I just didn't know about this. A verbal welcome by the lector or other suitable minister, followed by an indication of the hymn to be sung. An invitation to stand is most appropriate and should be normative at all masses. And then he talks about all of the, and by the way, this part is where it gets dangerous, like the type of things he's saying. Ministers are to wear the prescribed liturgical vesture as found in the general instruction of the Roman Missal and the ceremonial of bishops. In these instructions, there is no option given for pre-celebrants to wear berettas, cross their stoles, or wear a maniple. Similarly, chasubles cut in the manner commonly referred to as a fiddleback are strongly discouraged. These vestments are seen and understood by the faithful as a clear sign of a priest-celebrant who prefers the liturgical and possibly theological. What did he mean by this? And possibly theological. And possibly theological life of the church prior to Vatican II, given that these vestments have not been seen in most churches around the world since the 1960s. Priestly vesture is not intended to be the place for making such statements, intended or otherwise. The theological life of the church prior to Vatican II. I like the theological life of the church prior to Vatican II. Do you not like the theological? Who doesn't like the theological life of the church prior to Vatican II? That note right there was just very odd. There is no option given in the current liturgical books that prescribe certain vesting or divesting prayers. Prayerful preparation before Mass and Thanksgiving after Mass is to take place in some other way, and if possible, in common with the other assisting ministers. Hey, those prayers that you pray in private, don't do them. I'm your bishop. Listen to me. And then this next one. Women who have chosen to wear a veil as an expression of personal piety are not to do so when they are assisting in any official capacity. Lector, cantor, altar server, usher, etc. at Mass. My local parish, there's a woman who's an usher at Mass, and she always wears a veil. Guess you got it, and she's like 70-year-old Asian woman. Guess we're kicking off the 70-year-old Asian woman. Tell her you're not allowed to hand out bulletins to people while you're wearing your veil, because that means that you like the theological life of the church before Vatican II for reasons. In our present situation, Latin responses and Mass parts are not to be utilized in parish churches during regular celebrations since they hinder the people's participation. Musicum sacram. Wow, I wonder what happens. Interesting. So he quotes Musicum sacram. Let's pull this up real quick. Let's type in Latin, Latin. Oh wow. What are all of these? What are all of these statements about retaining the Latin? According to the Constitution of the Liturgy, the use of the Latin language, with due respect to particular laws, to be preserved in Latin rites. What in the world? Wait. What is this? Pastors of souls should take care that beside the vernacular, the faithful may also be able to say or sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them. Whoa. Wait. Where the vernacular has been introduced in the celebration of the Mass, the local ordinaries will judge whether it may be opportune to preserve one or more Masses celebrated in Latin, especially sung Masses, in certain churches, above all in large cities. Like Charlotte? Is Charlotte a large city or is it a small city? Where many come together with faithful of different languages? Wait a second. This can't be. But he quoted Musicum Sacram. Shouldn't it say this? As regard the use of Latin or the mother tongue in the sacred celebrations carried out in seminaries, the norms of the sacred congregation of seminaries and universities concerning the liturgical formation of the students should be observed. What is going on here? Wow. I mean, there's other quotes that I could read from it. There's literally like probably around 10 paragraphs which are about Latin and the liturgy and Musicum Sacram. It just gets so tiring, doesn't it, boys? They quote the texts, we read the texts. Retaining the use of masses celebrated in Latin is not opportune in our present reality, since the faithful are not accustomed to it. Exact opposite of what Musicum Sacram says. Even in places where they have become used to it by more recent practice, this becomes problematic for visitors and or new parishioners or those coming to the faith for the first time. Well, it seems like for those coming to the faith for the first time, basically everything is kind of new to them, but that's kind of it kind of comes along with being new, right? Okay. Then higher low masses and like quiet masses, like 7 a.m. masses at parishes. You can't do that. In order to show the equal dignity and role of the baptized faithful, both men and women, equal role of men and women. This is painful in my heart. No, there is not an equal role to men and women. Equal dignity, of course, but not equal role. It's just ridiculous. In order to show the equal dignity and role of the baptized faithful, both men and women may serve as extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, readers, and altar servers. No one may be denied a liturgical role proper to the faithful based on their gender. Communion stations. You can receive in both species. Altar servers not to wear gloves. Interesting. Altar servers not kneeling before the altar, because that's anti-Vatican II, apparently. Pastors are to catechize the faithful regularly on the normative posture for the reception of Holy Communion in the United States, which is standing after having made a bow of the head. So the pastors are supposed to tell everyone to stop kneeling for Holy Communion. Ministers and catechists are never allowed to teach that it is better to receive Holy Communion one legitimate way or another, or from an ordained minister rather than a lay Eucharistic minister. Lay extraordinary minister, rather. Altar rails and kneelers are not to be employed in the Diocese of Charlotte. Communion, and this is the W part, right? W is just because he had to say this. Communion may not be denied to those who, after bowing their heads, individually approaching the minister, kneel to receive the sacred host. So good. At least I'll never be rejected. Oh, my goodness. And then liturgical preferences. And these are the various different things that he says as a point of preference. And like weird things about like the purification of sacred vessels. Just anyways. And then yeah. That's about all for that. There's other things that I wanted to the article about Bishop Martin. Should I go into the article about Bishop Martin, because like it's a mess. It's an absolute mess when you go into the article about Bishop Martin. And this is from the Pillar. I guess I will go through this and then I'll answer questions and then we could be out of here. But this bishop is going to trigger a response from Rome. Yeah, the rumor is, and I mean, this is just rumor, so take it for what you will. But the rumor is that Prevost was not very thrilled about Martin becoming the bishop of our diocese, and that was something in which Pope Francis went over his head. That's just a rumor, though, so obviously completely unconfirmed, but they're both American clerics, so they have to have some sort of knowledge of each other, right? Okay, so and it's like such a disaster because a lot of people knew about that text. So yeah, I went through it. I went through the text of the church about this sort of thing. But you look at the environment around the bishop now. The environment around the bishop is just even more tragic. Even more tragic. The Bishop of Charlotte, North Carolina, and is from the Pillar, as I said, is expected to release new policies. And then he goes on and on and on. New policies, restrictions, blah, blah, blah. On Friday, May 23rd, Martin announced a policy in the diocese aimed at completing the implementation of Traditiones Custodes by prohibiting the Mass celebrated using a 1962 liturgical missal, sometimes called the Usus Antiquior, or traditional Latin Mass, from 4 parish churches in the diocese where it has been celebrated since 2021. Martin instead designated a soon-to-be established chapel in Mooresville, North Carolina, as a single locus for the Usus Antiquior in western North Carolina. While the bishop said the diocese would renovate the chapel and provide a priest for Sunday masses, the plan drew protests from Catholics who said the move was premature and unnecessary because the Vatican's Dicastery for Divine Worship had given permission for parish churches in Charlotte to continue offering Mass in the older form until October, and because the Dicastery had given extensions to parishes in other dioceses. Further, some Catholics said the move would cause hardship to families with devotion to the traditional Latin Mass, creating long drives to the Mooresville Chapel each Sunday. But amid pushback, the Charlotte Diocese has held firm in recent days, insisting that Martin was following the intention of Pope Francis's 2021 Motu Proprio Traditiones Custodes, and that it is the intention of the Church to see less attendance at traditional Latin Masses, despite their reportedly growing popularity among many younger Catholics in the United States and other Western countries. In a set of talking points issued over the weekend, the diocese explained that Pope Francis believed that allowing a more widespread celebration of the TLM was causing more division universally in the Church. While it is sad that some may leave the Church, it appears that the direction Pope Francis' request was implemented to cause less division over the longer term. The purpose of the new norms is clearly to limit access to the TLM, the diocese wrote. Before the May 23rd decision was announced, 4 parish priests in the Charlotte Diocese, those entrusted with the pastoral care of those attending the traditional Latin Mass in the diocese, wrote to Martin, urging him to reconsider his decision. That's what we read earlier. It is important to acknowledge that those attached to the traditional liturgy have, over the past 5 decades, often felt marginalized and discriminated against, and so on and so forth. We already read that. Martin did not acquiesce to that request, issuing restrictions on May 23rd and explaining talking points that Catholics, I didn't even read the talking points, but some of them were kind of bad. Explaining in talking points that Catholics aggravated by the decision should engage in some acts of penance and charity for the healing of the Church, and that Catholics in the diocese should call on the Holy Spirit to purge our hearts of division and the anger it foments. Martin's decision has been met with widespread criticism in the Charlotte Diocese, reportedly because several extraordinary form communities are integrated into local parishes, creating, according to some sources, a sense of solidarity between those who attend the older liturgies and Catholics attending other masses, which this is entirely the case. While that controversy continues, several sources close to the Chancery have told the Pillar that Martin will soon release a limited policy document addressing other liturgical practices in the Charlotte Diocese, especially the use of altar rails or prédus for Catholics who kneel for the reception of Holy Communion. Because the U.S. bishops established in 2021 that the norm for reception of Holy Communion in the Diocese of the United States is standing, the Charlotte text is expected to encourage catechists on that front, which some say will discourage kneeling to receive the Eucharist. Defenders say that such catechesis is in line with the Church's general instruction of the Roman Missal. Critics say that kneeling to receive the Eucharist has gained popularity in recent years and should be recognized as an increasingly customary practice among young Catholics, popular piety. And that the advice for catechists on standing for the Eucharist was dropped in 2010 in the 2010 revision of the U.S. edition in the general instruction for the Roman Missal. This is actually some big brain stuff right here. I didn't even know about the drop of the recommendation for catechists. Several sources close to the diocesan chancery confirmed that Martin had originally contemplated a far broader swath of liturgical restrictions related to the ordinary form of the Mass, among them a prohibition on Roman-style vestments and blah, blah, blah. We already went over this. A draft text dealing with these plans was published Wednesday. The Pillar has confirmed the authenticity of that draft text. But when those plans were raised this spring at meetings of both a diocesan presbyterial council and an ad hoc liturgical working group established by Martin, they were met with strong opposition from each group. sources close to the process told the pillar. So what happened with what we just read? So what we just read, it was a document, and this document was planned to be released. It was formed by the bishop, and what he did this spring is he took the document. He has his council of priests, which advise him, and then he also made a liturgical task force to advise him of individuals in the diocese who were able to give him good advice. And so he said, "Oh, I wrote this. What do you guys think about it?" And they all said, "This is awful. Please do not do this." So that's why it wasn't promulgated, because it still has the language of Pope Francis this, Pope Francis that, because he was still Pope when it was when it was written. So it's probably sometime during Lent. The Presbyteral Council panned it because so much of it goes against the general instruction of the Roman Missal. Yeah, and by the way, this is another point that I didn't bring up, but some individuals were bringing it up. Let me bring up a tweet about this. Father Paul, he's a canonist. I'm not a canonist. And he also talks about the general instruction, how there's weird contradictions between the proposed document and the general instruction. The bishop didn't want to roll out the whole policy without any support of the Presbyteral Council, another source explained. He felt differently about the TLM because he had the support of Traditiones. But the Novus Ordo plans got panned by everyone who talked about them across the entire theological spectrum of the presbyterate. One source told the pillar that Benedictine abbot Placid Solari of North Carolina's Belmont Abbey, Belmont Abbey is in our diocese, a member of the Presbyteral Council, was particularly instrumental in urging Martin to restrict his policy proposals to the limitations of the general instruction of the Roman Missal. Meanwhile, while seeming to shelf his broader plans, Martin has reportedly told priests that he plans soon to issue a prohibition against using altar rails for the distribution of Holy Communion. That's his big thing. He's really focused on that, one source said. So things are still going to come, by the way. So yeah, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, the original thing was not proposed. Yeah, it wasn't proposed, but there's still going to be things which are going to trickle out. But sources in the diocese think that Martin might eventually publish more elements of the policy draft in a piecemeal fashion and over time. And he already requires this stuff when he goes somewhere in the diocese for Mass, a source explained. Martin has not yet responded to questions from the pillar. The recent flare-up over liturgy is part of a larger pattern of problems in the diocese since Martin arrived late May, several sources have said. So he's been here a year. The bishop, a conventual Franciscan, was installed in Charlotte in May 2024, reportedly with the enthusiastic support of Atlanta's Archbishop Gregory Hartmeyer, also a conventual Franciscan friar, who is the metropolitan archbishop in the province which includes the Charlotte Diocese. Martin, 63, spent most of his priestly life in high school education and campus ministry, until in 2022 Hartmeyer appointed him pastor of an Atlanta Archdiocese parish. Soon after the appointment, Charlotte's Bishop Peter Jugis asked the Vatican to allow him early retirement, and Martin was appointed to lead the Charlotte Diocese. In both Atlanta and Charlotte, some Catholics have speculated that Hartmeyer, likely aware of Jugis's health condition, appointed Martin a pastor in order to bolster the prospect of his eventual appointment as Jugis's successor. But however he got there, Martin's tenure in Charlotte has been marked by some controversy. Sources in the diocese told the pillar that an anonymous open letter to Martin, circulated in the diocese in January 2025, had support from much of the diocesan presbyterate when it was published, as it flagged several alleged issues with Martin's leadership. Among the issues noted in the letter were arbitrary micromanagement, the speed of change and lack of pastoral sensitivity, failure to consider the effects of decisions, and insufficient synodality in the diocese, which amounted to an autocratic approach, which everything in this letter which we just read kind of supports this. The letter urged Martin to please consider freezing any major changes for at least 2 years, allowing time to establish relationships across the diocese, listen in fulfillment of your word, and provide yourself time to understand the unique needs of this diocese. This pause would also demonstrate a true willingness to understand your flock prior to navigating the ship in a new course. While sources acknowledge that anonymous open letters in the Church's life are usually dismissed easily, One source in the diocese explained that, quote, "This was unusually well-sourced and informed, respectful, but explained the issues in our diocese really well, which is why it resonated so much with priests across the theological spectrum," end quote. Some sources pointed to a Catholic Leadership Institute study conducted earlier this year in the Charlotte Diocese, which flagged Martin's speed of change in building trust as areas in need of improvement in the diocese. While the full study has not been released publicly, it reportedly included complaints of an authoritarian style of leadership, at odds with the synodality promoted by Pope Francis. He presumes the trust of priests, but doesn't gain it, one source said. That's why, even with assignments, they just don't trust that he has their best interests at heart. The diocesan talking point memo offered a different perspective. Listening and agreeing aren't the same thing, the text explained. Bishop Martin cares deeply for everyone in Western North Carolina, as is the mandate of every shepherd for the church. 136 comments. But yeah, these are the other issues which are going on in the diocese as well. And this is just awful. I mean, let's just pray for Bishop Martin. Let's pray for the priests of the diocese, for the laymen. Let's pray for the church at large. Pray for everyone who's able to endure and deal through the situation, because it's obviously not a good situation. Okay, well, I'm gonna answer the super chats now. I like how Wagner's mods are either Eastern Orthodox or Crypto Sedes. Both groups don't like me, by the way. Both Eastern Orthodox and Sedevacantists. Sources report that B. Wagner helped draft the document. It wasn't me, I promise. It wasn't me. And by the way, for those in the Charlotte Diocese who are listening up to this point or know people in the Charlotte Diocese, there will be a meeting at the new chapel, I believe June 24th, June 24th-ish, that week, one of those days that week. I think it's the 24th, though. There will be a meeting. The bishop will be showing up. I will be attending. He's asked for people to come and to, for him to hear out their concerns. So I hope that I can express my concerns to him. Obviously, when you go there, don't act like a monkey. Act civil. Treat him with respect as a bishop, and shepherd your souls. Again, don't lose your soul over this issue. Just a reminder. Okay, this isn't a public call to, this isn't like a fatwa on my bishop. Well, the bishop of the location which I reside, to clarify. Why was the 65 missile replaced with the Novus Ordo Missae? I don't know. Italians are brown confirmed, so true. I never understood why the Vatican just didn't take the TLM as it was and just translate it into the vernacular and then offer both forms every Sunday. That is a good point. Or at least, what the easiest would have been to those parts which do not offer repetition, those parts which are different every week, just make those in the vernacular. That would seem to be the most obvious solution, because it's easy to memorize, a set form of text that you're going to hear every single Sunday for your whole life. It's hard to memorize changing texts that are different every single Sunday. Seems to be the obvious solution for me, but I don't know. That's above my pay grade. Wagner changing his name to Brother Raphael OSB when? Never. Sounding schismatic there. I promise I'm not. The entire point of active participation in the liturgy is uniting yourself to the sacrifice. How does not knowing Latin hinder that? So true. The sacrificial aspect of the Eucharist, which is often forgotten. Most people only focus on the sacramental aspect of the liturgy. Archbishop Lefebvre, pray for us. Okay, Saint Marcel Lefebvre, pray for us. Okay. We talking about the Bishop Martin episcopacy speedrun might be the fastest we'll ever see a bishop removed from his see. I mean, it seems like if, and obviously this is far, far above my pay grade and far, far above my pay grade. But that sort of act from His Holiness would just be like, he would gain so much credibility with so many individuals. and many bishops would have the fear, the fear in the eyes of the bishops, who want to try to give like arbitrary liturgical norms to their diocese, which are illegal and against the norms established by the church. It would be one of the best things. I've met a lot of old time religious order priests with bishops' exact views. Fewer parish priests / bishops. Odd. Glad he didn't promulgate these laws. Yeah, I mean, he should be glad that he didn't promulgate these laws because that would have been disastrous for him. Also, full active and conscious participation in the Catholic worship includes Latin, much as many long Paschal readings, which are also difficult. Some difficulty is not a sufficient objection. So true, Riveron. Christian, you forgot that people are too retarded to hear Latin. You know what? It's weird that he like brings up all these immigrant communities. If somebody is, immigrant communities, there's usually like Hispanics in the Diocese of Charlotte. Like, yeah, there's some Africans, but it's usually just, the Latinx community. It's literally in the name Latinx, anyways. But for a Hispanic person to hear the Lord's Prayer in Latin, is that the hardest thing for them to understand? It's just really the hardest. Like how stupid do you think these people are? Like they speak a native Romance language and they can't understand certain short prayers that they have memorized in a different language that is close to their own language. Latin Boys Association versus Modernism. Who's in? If the okay, thank you for the super chat. The only thing I like about this document is his elitist authoritarianism. Oh man, yeah, it's actually I want bishops to be authoritarian, but I want them to be authoritarian with the stuff I agree with. The bishop is going to trigger a response from Rome. Hope so. Bishop early life check. I don't know. As an altar server, should I be talking with my priest about doing more traditional actions? For example, kneeling at altar. Just do whatever your priest says. You don't need to. You don't need. I mean, if your priest has those types of interests and like is disposed towards those things, like I can't see any harm in asking. But like going out of your way to just like cause that conversation to happen, it's not really necessary. I mean, if you express interest and you kind of just discern that he's interested in this, sure. Synodality is going to give the trads what they want. LOL. Synodality leads to Latin Mass being reinstated in Charlotte Diocese. That would be funny. Latin would seem to be a unifying force for a community with a lot of immigrants. This is literally what Musicam Sacram says. This is okay. This is like the annoying part. Okay, so let's look in Vatican II. This is Vatican II for you. I think large cities. Yeah. So this is what Vatican II says. Where the vernacular has been introduced into the celebration of Mass, the local ordinaries, so the bishops, will judge whether it may be opportune to preserve one or more Masses celebrated in Latin, especially sung Masses in certain churches, above all in large cities where many come together with faithful of different languages. So they say if you have immigrant communities, if you want to like have a unified parish community, unified parish life, said, oh, well, what bishops should do in those cases is have one or more Masses in Latin. And then we'll solve our problem. He quotes this document in the. I'm molding. I'm seething right now. I'm seething. I see stuff like this, and it causes me to seethe so hard. That immigrant thing was old school boomer racism. Okay, never mind. That was my favorite part of the document. That's a joke. It's a joke, guys. How much do you attribute decisions like this to misguided but genuine care for the church versus outright subversion? Well, at first, when it came to the implementation of Traditionis Custodes, I wanted to give them the best reading possible. You call me naive, call me stupid, call me whatever, but I wanted to try to give them the best reading possible. When it comes to everything else that's come back, everything else that's come out, like, yeah, this is just not appropriate behavior, appropriate leadership style, as His Holiness Leo XIV has written about so much. Yeah, I think I'm done the stream. Hour and 40 minutes. Anyways, I don't need to repeat everything I've said already. If you want to go to the meeting with the Bishop Martin, with the Bishop Martin Real, with Bishop Martin, go to the meeting. Don't act like a monkey. Make sure you remember to go to the oh, I guess I'll share it again. But do not forget to appeal. You know, if as an individual you're able to appeal, as a group of individuals you're able to appeal. When it comes to a parish, only the pastor can appeal. But this is on tanbooks.com. In their Latin Mass section, they have this. You can go to their Twitter, Tanbooks Twitter. They posted on Twitter. But you have a right in canon law to appeal. So exercise that right. It eventually gets into the ears of those who may hear. Anyways, yeah, black pilling. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.